All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's on the Power. So I thought an interesting topic for a video would be comparing six-time Mr. Olympia Dorian Yates with our current Mr. Olympia, 2018 Mr. Olympia Shawn Rhoden. Now, the reason why I feel this would be an interesting comparison is because a lot of people credit Dorian Yates with ushering in the era of the mass monster. They credit Dorian Yates as being one of the first guys to really have that mass monster look and set the bar higher for future competitors in the coming years, to get bigger to compete with Dorian. And as a result, we had guys like Marcus Rule, Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler. The list goes on, and the physiques got bigger and bigger up until present day where we had Big Ramy. Now, with Shawn Rhoden, it's a little bit different. A lot of people, including myself, have made the argument that Shawn Rhoden winning the Mr. Olympia is kind of a sign of ushering in a new era in bodybuilding, and maybe that means a more aesthetic, downsized era in bodybuilding. Shawn Rhoden is a very different Mr. Olympia to Mr. Olympias prior, and I think a comparison with Dorian Yates would be a very good example of exemplifying those differences. So I wanted to go pose for pose here and compare Dorian Yates and Shawn Rhoden. And I really wanted to give Dorian Yates some credit in this video because a lot of people, give Dorian Yates a lot of criticism for the mass monster thing. And also when they think of Dorian, they think of the 1997 Mr. Olympia, which was a very controversial result. A lot of people had Nasser El Somebody beating Dorian because Dorian was very off that year. And that would also be Dorian's last Olympia. So a lot of people tend to remember Dorian for that, where he didn't really look as good as he usually does. But if you go into the first pose and start off really strong here, this is Shawn Rhoden's best pose, the abs and thighs pose. And if you compare Shawn and Dorian both hitting the abs and thighs, Dorian actually looks really good in the abs and thighs shot. Now, one of Dorian's strongest points to his physique during his competitive career was the width and size of his lats. In particular, even when viewed from the front lat spread, the front double bicep, the abs and thighs, giving him that taper. Even though he had a blockier physique, his lats were so big and wide, it was still able to give him a taper. Even though his waist might have been a little blockier than other bodybuilders, the lats really helped with that flow of his physique. Whereas Shawn Rhoden, he has the crazy wide shoulders, crazy small waist, really good abdominal development. The lat thickness and really the lat size just really wasn't there from the back or as much from the front as it was with Dorian Yates. So even when you take Shawn versus Dorian in the abs and thighs, I think it's still a pretty comparable pose for both of them. But I think overall, Shawn would take that pose and be the better poser in the abs and thighs because of the sheer development and detail in his abs compared to Dorian's. I think was far superior, and the pose is in fact called the abs and thighs pose. All right, so now that we've looked at a pose that was a pretty decent pose for both men, let's look at a pose for both of these guys that really wasn't necessarily their best pose, and that is the front double bicep. I think the main criticism of both Dorian Yates and Shawn Rhoden is the arm development, but specifically the biceps. Now, I think for Dorian, this was one of his worst poses, and I think for Shawn, even though his arms weren't really a strong point for him, this is one of his best poses in today's bodybuilding lineup. Because one of the problems with today's bodybuilders is the midsection and the blocky look to the physique. And one of the strong points that Shawn Rhoden has in the front double bicep is how aesthetic he looks in the front double bicep, the taper he has, the small waist. And even though the arm size isn't really that incredible, it still looks very impressive because of the way he hits the pose and just the way the body looks from the front overall. Now, I would certainly say that from a bicep standpoint, Shawn had better arms than Dorian. Shawn's main criticism comes from the triceps. But when it comes to Dorian, you can really see that the main problem with Dorian's biceps is the insertions. And then, of course, in 1997, the photos that you look at of his front double bicep, a lot of this was due to injury that made the arms look atrophied like that. But I think for Dorian, the main struggle was the insertions, and then also the fact that his midsection and his upper body in general, his lats, his chest, and the thickness of his waist was so big and blocky. It was hard for him to look aesthetic in the front double bicep and not look blocky. And it's really hard for him to have arms that caught up with the rest of his body because his body was so massive in general. In fact, I think the best photo of Dorian hitting a front double bicep was from that 1993 photo shoot, not even in, competition condition. I think this was a couple weeks out. But those famous black and white photos of Dorian Yates, I think that was the best photo ever taken of Dorian hitting a front double bicep. He looks phenomenal in that particular picture. But in the majority of stage photos, I think we tend to see a lackluster front double bicep from Dorian Yates. Now, the next pose I want to look at here is a pose that Dorian Yates was really the king of, whether it was from the front or whether it was from the back, and that is the lat spread pose. Now, Dorian Yates from the front, I think, had one of the most iconic lat spreads, just because, before Dorian, there was never really a case of a guy that had such visible lats from the front. I mean, this guy's lats were so big and full that in the front lat spread, in some of the photos, I think his lats take up the same amount, if not more surface area than his chest does in the front lat spread. But I think if you want to look at a pose where Dorian Yates really takes Shawn Rhoden to task, and really you can see the advantage that Dorian has over Shawn Rhoden, you got to look at the back shots, specifically the back lat spread and the back double bicep. Now, one of the main criticisms and the main problems with Shawn Rhoden's physique is the thickness and development in his back. The detail isn't really there once you get in the mid to lower back. The thickness isn't really there once you get to the mid to lower back. He has a decent back. I'm not going to say he has a horrible back, but in comparison to the rest of today's lineup, you could say his back probably isn't up to par with some of the guys like Phil Heath or Big Ramy that he's going up against. I think even Shawn Rhoden himself would admit that his back is probably one of his biggest weak points when it comes to winning the Olympia or possibly defending the Olympia title. That's probably one of the things he would admit that he would focus most heavily on trying to bring up in terms of overall development, detail, and thickness. Now, Dorian Yates, on the other hand, had no problem with back development. In fact, Dorian Yates was famous for all the aspects of his back that he had that Shawn Rhoden didn't. The thickness, the graininess, and the detail all at the same time were the things that made Dorian Yates' back so iconic. And the photos of Dorian Yates' back so iconic is because it was so complete. The traps were just insanely thick and full, but at the same time, with this crazy size and this crazy mass, Dorian Yates was still able to come in with Christmas tree conditioning on multiple occasions in that lower back. So really, Dorian had one of the most complete backs of his era and of his reign at the Mr. Olympia. And that's one of the things that fans loved so much about Dorian Yates is not only was he this new mass monster, gigantic bodybuilder like no one had ever seen before, but he didn't just come in big like we see today with a guy like Big Ramy. Not only would he come in big, he would come in with crazy, grainy, shredded conditioning, the Christmas tree in the lower back. In the 90s, having shredded glutes wasn't really as important, but on many occasions, Dorian Yates had, to some degree, shredded glutes. The hamstrings were there. Pretty much everything from a conditioning standpoint that you could ask for from a bigger bodybuilder. Dorian was still able to nail that and still come in with the same amount of crazy size, fullness, etc., up until 1997. I think a lot of people would agree that 1997 Dorian wasn't the Dorian we're used to seeing. It wasn't the Dorian that we should remember Dorian for being. I think that 1993 to 1994, maybe 92 to 94 Dorian was the Dorian that we will remember for being that crazy mass monster. So I would probably give both of the back poses to Dorian, and I would give the front double and the abs and thighs both to Shawn Rhoden. Now, the next pose I want to talk about here was a pose that was kind of controversial at the 2018 Olympia, and probably an even larger subject of discussion than the back poses of Shawn Rhoden, was the side tricep of Shawn Rhoden compared to the side tricep of Phil Heath. Now, obviously, Phil Heath is well known for having these crazy developed arms, and Shawn Rhoden not so much. And a lot of people gave the abs and thighs pose to Shawn Rhoden because of how good the other elements of his physique looked in the side tricep compared to Phil Heath. The midsection, the taper, the detail, the legs, the conditioning, everything that Shawn was able to show off by the way he hit that side tricep, whereas when Phil hit it, you could still see the gut sticking out, is why a lot of people would give that pose to Shawn Rhoden. But a lot of people argue the pose is called a side tricep for a reason. The main thing you should be looking at is the tricep, and admittedly, Shawn Rhoden doesn't really have the best triceps. Arguably, he has, I don't mean this as hate. I don't want to hate on Shawn Rhoden, but probably some of the worst triceps out of that top 6 on the Olympia stage. And I say that, again, not out of hate, but just out of reality, because the main pose where the triceps are judged is that side tricep. And when you look at Shawn actually hit the side tricep, the triceps almost look non-existent. And I got to give Shawn credit. That's why he plays to his strengths and hits that side tricep the way that he does to show off the rest of his physique, because he probably knows that the triceps aren't going to be the strongest point of that pose. And that's one of the things about bodybuilding you have to remember is to showcase your strengths and try to hide your weaknesses. And that's where good posing comes into play. So props to Shawn Rhoden for the good posing. But if you compare Dorian Yates' side tricep to Shawn Rhoden's side tricep, I think Dorian Yates has to be the hands-down winner of that pose. Like I said before, I mean, I feel like the freakiness and the graininess in particular of Dorian's physique is what he was well known for. And I think in that side tricep pose, the graininess of Dorian's physique is really, really well exemplified in that pose. And I would have to give the side tricep to Dorian. Now, the side chest, I would say we have a very similar situation. Dorian Yates in the side chest is able to show off the graininess of his physique and looks very, very impressive. Shawn Rhoden in the side chest is able to hit the pose in a very complete way where he shows off not only the chest, the arms, the shoulders, but the crazy separation that he had in his legs. He knew his conditioning was fantastic at the 2018 Mr. Olympia, and he's able to show that even in the side chest pose. And then finally, we would have the most muscular pose, which again, I think both men look very impressive in this pose, but I would have to give it to Dorian for the same reason I would give Dorian the side tricep and the side chest. And that reason is the graininess of Dorian's physique in the most muscular, which I think is really one of the main things that the most muscular is looking for. In addition to overall muscularity, I think the graininess of the muscle and the conditioning of the muscle in the most muscular is very, very important. So that is my comparison of Shawn Rhoden and Dorian Yates. Personally, I would end up giving it to Dorian Yates of having the better physique. But keep in mind, this is not a negative reflection on Shawn Rhoden. Dorian Yates, of course, is a 6-time Mr. Olympia, and Shawn Rhoden just won his first one. And I would just have to give it to Dorian's physique compared to Shawn's Olympia physique. But I thought it would be an interesting comparison considering both of these men are considered to have ushered in a new era in bodybuilding. Shawn Rhoden ushering in a more aesthetic era in bodybuilding, and Dorian Yates being the guy that a lot of people credit, again, with being the guy that ushered in the mass monster era. So let me know in the comment section below which physique you prefer, Dorian Yates or Shawn Rhoden. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.